Thank you, Anne. Do you hear me well? Yes. Good. So, thanks, Anne. I was saying to Derek, it's great to come here. I have a lot of memories at Waterloo somehow. I used to come very often when you were in the old building, so that's like in the 90s, I guess. And I got to know a lot of people here, and it's great to come back, and somehow I stopped being invited, so I always wondered why. So here I am back, so it's great to be here. And I was kind of thinking, when I'm an historian primarily, I'm an architect, as Anne said, so I'm teaching studio, and I'm trying to implicate myself in contemporary ideas, but bottom line, I'm an historian. That's what I do with most intensity, I'd say. And it's always a bit of a problem coming to schools of architecture to talk about historical stuff. It used to be okay, in the 80s. And now it's less so. So it's always kind of a risk. A risk in the sense just having a receptive audience. So I did decide tonight I will talk about historical material. It's going to be very strange, I think. Hope you'll follow and trust my reading of a certain book by Viollet-le-Duc. Anyway, I wanted to say that one thing that I like about Waterloo, and I really, for me, Waterloo is it has a place in my mind. And one of those things is about, of course, you guys being invested in the historical aspect of things. So you are running a Rome program, and from what I understood in my conversations, it's still something that you feel very important in the school. So I find that heroic, perhaps. Like it's kind of interesting. Now we do global studios, right? That's the new mode of moving abroad. So we go in places which somehow represent the future of the planet. So we do global studios in whatever strange cities like Shanghai or Singapore or Lagos or things like that. But to go back to Rome is really it's not a given, let's say. It used to be something very natural. There's a big tradition, of course, of schools of architecture going in Rome, but I think it's something that is no longer something we take for granted. So I'm not sure if there's debates about this in your school. I'm not sure if some of you question Rome versus Tokyo, but I think I actually admire that in some ways. So, and I was saying that I think it was Derek too, I was saying this too, but that there's a sort of interesting, we're sister schools, McGill and Waterloo that way. McGill's very different operation than here, but it also has a very long-standing tradition of being invested in historical studies. So I think that, for me, to me it's a little odd. There's something a bit odd about that. It's not mainstream anymore, and in that sense, I think it's interesting when it kind of is slightly displaced. And I graduated, by the way, when in 1980, my first degree at McGill, and it was exactly when Waterloo's Rome program was set up. So it was I was trained in what we call the postmodern years, which have had a lot of bad press. So I'm not sure what it rings in your mind, the postmodern years, that it had a lot of bad press. But for me, I'm so glad I was trained during that time. I think there's something incredible about those decades where history and the idea of architecture as a cultural enterprise was so central. Now it's more, I feel now we shift, and Yasha here, we shift towards this notion that architecture is about nature, right? We're more interested in architecture about nature, whether it's the digital, who plays with genetic encoding, or of course the whole issue of sustainability and landscape urbanism and all these things that we do now, which are more having to do with climate and natural things. So, and the historical seems somewhat or belated or not relevant anymore, or some kind of indulgence. And I do think, for me, I still have that sense that we need to think historically about our discipline, otherwise we will just fall through our fingers. Now, we can, of course, ask if we need to think of ourselves as Greco-Roman or Roman. I think that's an interesting question to put. You know, why should we go to Rome specifically, apart from just the pleasure of being in Rome, which is still great, though there's so many tourists now that it's sometimes problematic. But anyway, Rome is, of course, as a city, interesting. But why, you know, we go to Rome for what reason exactly? I think it's an interesting question to ask, and not so much in terms of the notion whether going to Rome means we're Western-centric or now we're multicultural, so we can't just be Western, you know, and not in that sense, though that, of course, are real questions. But it's more like the way we think history, like how do we think of history? And I think it's important. I'm very interested currently with the notion of hauntings, of ghostly presence and things like that. So I think to rethink the contrast between past and future is something really interesting to me. And here I write here, how much of philosophical, scientific, political, and artistic thought is caught up with the idea of historical continuity. And I'm interested in thinking about the disjointedness of time and space. And my talk will be a bit psychoanalytical, by the way, so I think Anne hinted at that. So I'm going to bring that material a little bit more than I usually do. But Freud once claimed that, of course, the unconscious has no time. So I think that's an interesting thing to think about. And one of the reasons why I'm so attracted towards the 19th century, apart from the fact that it just becomes habitual, you're cut in it in some ways, but why I'm interested in that century is that, well, first of all, it's a time which we're completely fascinated by the past, so almost to a kind of pathological, it's almost pathological in the 19th century. You know, I spoke in my book, quoting another author, of the desire for history. There's a real longing for the past in the 19th century. And like anything that has to do with the unconscious, of course, it's paradoxical, because on the one hand, the 19th century is an advanced modern period. So when we move to the 19th century, we're already, all of the real consequences of modernity have been really well laid out. So when you enter that century, modernity is well established as a system of thinking. So it is, you know, it has completely absorbed the idea that time is history. In other words, that the past is past. So that's something that the 19th century knows perfectly. So they feel a bit outside the history in a sense. But on the other hand, it is highly aware, and I think probably more than any other eras before, that the past leaves traces, that the past is always prowling around, you know, that it stays and somehow you cannot get rid of it. And they believe, the 19th century, and believe that there's such thing as breaches in time, that somehow there's ruptures in time, you know, there's these passageways. And that, you know, the whole culture of revivalism in architecture, which I find really interesting and fascinating, has to do with this notion that, yes, we can be Gothic again, right? That it's possible that the Gothic comes back. It's kind of an interesting idea. So there's you know, 19th century is at once the century of progress, but it's also the century of where time is not linear, you know, that it can take other kinds of patterns, if you'd like. So my work has focused on the origins of architectural modernism, and in other words, I've been asking, oh, of course, sorry, how do I move this? How do I change just the arrows here? Yeah, okay. So I wanted to show this as, of course, a nod towards Anne, but as an interesting, fascinating image which shows the kind of complexity, you know, the complexity of how the 19th century architect, in this case, thought about time. Now, so as I was saying, so you know, my work largely has been about modernism. Like now I'm realizing this as I'm aging, that's what I've been always doing. So, you know, how modernisms related to its own past and how it dealt with the issue of inheritance. I'm very interested in the notion of inheritance. Now, it may seem very curious to search the origins of modernism because modernism, as a general attitude, has been precisely to deny any origins. Like it's a refusal of one's inheritance, right? So it's a killing of the father, which this beautiful poster for the Bergman exhibition 1927 shows very well. But, you know, and I'm quoting here Jacques Derrida, who wrote, and I think it's a very nice quote from him. He says, "Either before wanting or refusing to be, we are inheritors. And like all inheritors, we are in mourning." So we always inherit, whether we want it or not. We cannot but be inheritors, of course. We're historical beings, in essence. So, and to inherit is to receive a gift or a debt, of course. And that the reception of a gift or debt is, of course, dependent upon loss. You inherit when you lose something or someone. And you know, perhaps, and that's an hypothesis, the sense of loss or the state of mourning is perhaps stronger in the modern period. So there's a greater sense of loss in the modern era, though presumably that has always been there. So to be modern is to inherit the past, as we must inherit, but in a peculiar way. And my lecture is about that. It's about trying to explore what that can mean. Like, how do we modern? I put aside all the hyper-modern or the post-modern or all these categories. I just say we're modern. So how do we modern have negotiated the issue of inheritance? And I'd like to go through a certain body of work and trying to capture that in all its complexity. Now, some of the themes I'll talk about may seem a bit belated, like prosthetics and cyborg, and you know, these were critical terms 20 years ago. I'm going to bring those back. Reinhold Martin recently, gave a conference in Zurich, and he, after my lecture, which was not this one, but something similar, so Martin, nobody talks about prosthesis anymore. Like, don't talk about this. This is gone. This is passé. This was 20 years ago. Anyway, I'm trying to bring that back as something significant. And what I actually do, which I don't think has been done before, is to show the presence of that theme in the 19th century. And I hope that it perhaps can tie into the debates that I hope are agitating in this school about why do we do cultural history? Why do we go to Rome? What does it mean to study the past? Why do we have to do this? It's not obvious. It's not a given. These things have to be, you know, and I guess my lecture is about trying to see how that we can think through this. It's a dark lecture, by the way. It's not all pleasant. But I'm still using Viollet-le-Duc as an example, despite all the darkness. Now, so the theme of inheritance and of a mournful relation to the past is certainly a good way to introduce Viollet-le-Duc. Here I'm showing him in 3 stages of his life. 1840, when he started his first restoration work, in 65, when he was at the apex of his career, basically controlling much of the cultural politics of the Second Empire. He was a very close ally of Napoleon III. And in 1978, just the year before he died, when he was in complete despair. So he's of course a interesting figure to look at when you think about the past, because his entire life work was structured around his relation to history. First, he was the greatest and most daring restoration architect of his age, and here I'm showing this is Notre Dame de Paris, his most prestigious work, but he's worked on all the major cathedrals in France. This is before him, this is after him. You can look at the details. It's fascinating how he stabilized the rose window, so you can see how dynamic it was before, and he actually changed it, rebuilt it completely. And of course, he's the one who did these gargoyles that you all know. He designed all 56 of them. And he did these hysterical reconstruction. Actually, not so hysterical. In fact, it's Carcassonne, you all know this, of course. And one that's less known and incredible is the Château Pierrefonds near Paris. But he was also a vocal apostle of the neo-Gothic faction, so he really wanted to, one of his battle cry was that we have to become Gothic again. And I'll tell you a bit what that means. And of course, he was the fiercest enemy of the École des Beaux-Arts, so he was understood, despite all this relation to the past, he was understood as a progressive force, as someone who wanted to overthrow the academic tradition of the 19th century. And he was, of course, and he's mostly known today as the most famous theoretician of modernism in the 19th century, together with Ruskin and Gottfried Semper. So he's one of the great figures of architectural theory in terms of a modern theory of architecture. Summerson said that there's only two great theoreticians in the history of architecture, Viollet-le-Duc and Alberti. I think that's overdone, but still, his status is quite impressive. He was thus all at once accepting the past and rejecting it, and I want to dwell on that ambiguity. Now, to understand what is at issue, I will follow a somewhat circuitous route, starting with the end, as it were, because this is one of the last drawings that Viollet-le-Duc produced. It was drawn actually just a few weeks before he died, in the summer of 1879, while he was sitting on a Tonèche chair in his villa in Lausanne at the foot of the Alps. And it's the image of a mechanized artificial organ showing how the workings of muscles and tendons in animals can be used as models for mechanical devices. It's a really striking drawing. Actually, to my knowledge, it's unique in the annals of 19th century technical illustrations. We're, of course, very familiar with the Cartesian mechanistic worldview, and I assume that you've covered that in your cultural history courses, namely that when Descartes thinks that the workings of living organism can be understood by looking at machines. The mechanistic worldview, that's a very familiar, and it's going to be a dominant paradigm in the West up till the 19th century. So Descartes thought that we could understand how organisms work by looking at machines, which is crazy, but that's something that he did, and it was actually largely spurred by these kinds of creations. This is actually an 18th century automata, but they were actually developed in the 17th century, and it's largely because of these inventions that Descartes and his group were actually started to use the machine as a paradigm to actually analyze our own bodies. But Viollet-le-Duc's drawing is exactly the opposite. It's absolutely the opposite. He says, he illustrates how the study of organisms can help us build machines. So it's completely the opposite. He says we have to look at a living organism in order to know how to build machines. So it's a reversal of the Cartesian mechanistic worldview. And it's quite striking and a very early instance of that reversal, which will become very important in the 20th century, of course. And the drawing, by the way, was inserted in a short didactic children novella. Wait a second. L'histoire d'un dessinateur. And I'll be talking a lot about that book. And here's the context of that drawing in the book. So it was inserted in an anatomy lesson with the two main protagonists of this novel, which is, on the one hand, the industrialist Majorin and his young protégé Petit-Jean. I'll come back on these figures later. So and here I'm partly quoting, through the study of anatomy, explained Majorin to his young pupil, one can gain a new understanding of machines and factories. And I quote here, for men in the art of mechanization seldom does more than apply anatomical elements. In other words, machines are modeled upon organisms. And he adds, and I quote again, he says, one could write a whole treatise on mechanics, taking as the sole subject the curvature of the bones. And Viollet-le-Duc even hints at a possible continuity between machines and humans. He says, and I quote again, the organs of men's best machines are generally made in conformity to the principle by which his body moves. So we make our machines in the same way as we move. Now, these observations in general can be related to the linkage between bodies and machines in the industry factory assembly line, and more generally the history of gestures and postures of the first industrial age when the machine progressively took over the human habitus. So we can contextualize these comments in relationship to the development of industrialization and the need for men to work on machine assembly lines. So therefore our bodies and the machine have to work together. But there were other strains of discussions on machine mechanisms in the 19th century, which I suspect was much more influential, or at least closer to Viollet-le-Duc's mind. And these take place in very odd corpus of work, which is the development of philosophy of technology, which emerges in the 19th century as an idea, and it comes out of ethnological studies. In other words, what is the origin of tools? How the tools are born, which is in some ways how is culture born? So these studies on the origin of tools describe machines as projections of the self. So tools are projections of our body, they're extensions of our body. And one of the chief figure on that, and I have an image here that shows some of these analysis where they show how the axe, for instance, is exactly modeled along the proportions of the hand, that it actually not only do the axe extend the arm, so they're extension of an organ and allows us to do things that we couldn't do without, but the very axe itself is informed by the shape of the organ. And according to one of the key figures of that idea, this was an unconscious process. We unconsciously reproduced ourselves in our tools. So I quote here, like any other primitive tools, the hammer, writes Kapp, is a projection of our organs or the mechanical reconstruction of an organic form, which allows man to amplify at will the strength of his arm thanks to the skill of his hands. So, and I quote again, we conceive of organ projection as, on the one hand, the unconscious transposition of something corporal outwards through a material reproduction, and on the other hand, as the retrospective use of mechanisms for the intelligibility of the organism. So in some ways, it explains the Cartesian position. It wraps it in it. We first unconsciously project ourselves in our machines, and then after our machines allow us to understand our own bodies. So, in other words, when making tools, man unconsciously transforms the form and the functional relationship of his corporal organization, and he takes consciousness only afterwards of the analogy which they entertain with himself. Now, there's no document that linked Viollet-le-Duc to that sort of discourse, but it's an idea that is well attuned to his thinking in general. He was one of the greatest proponents of the biological model for architecture, so he actually described buildings as projections of the self. So he says the body is the myth of the structure. So he kind of revived the Vitruvian idea. And he always took great care, as we'll see, to study the gestures and body positions of craftsmen, soldiers, and other men of action. Now, coming back to Viollet-le-Duc's Histoire d'un dessinateur, can we say that if machines are projections from the self, as Viollet-le-Duc claims himself in his didactic novella, we could say that in creating machines, we're not only extending our organs, but also reshaping our bodies. In other words, creating ourselves anew. That is a stretch, I think. I'm pushing the idea, but it also is a kind of implicit possibility that I'd like to test by analyzing the novel. And in those terms, the issue of inheritance and our relation to the past comes back. So, I mean, in a way, the prosthetic is in some ways you could say a kind of form of resentment to our inheritance because we make ourselves. So we have the capacity to become our own fathers, as a sense. So I say Kapp's theory of organ projection could be described as a prosthetic theory of culture. Prosthesis is, of course, a theme profoundly embedded in modern culture, tied to the debates around the cyborg and the post-human. So, of course, I used the latest one. I'm sure some of you have seen that film, which is really very good, I think. But it's so familiar. I mean, we've seen like dozens of these kinds of movies. But in contrast to these kinds of representation, Kapp's theory, if we keep with Kapp, Ernst Kapp, he's a German, by the way. he worked out of, anyway, I don't want to, let's not divert on describing who he is. But Cap's theory is the prosthesis impulse is originally human. In other words, it's original. It's not some late development of a post-human phase. It is originally human. It's embedded in the very fabric of what it means to be human. So there's a kind of distinction between that body of work and what the whole discourse on the post-human that's emerged in the last 30 years. But I don't want to delve too much in abstractions. I just want to follow closely what that meant for Viollet-le-Duc. That's what I would like to do with you, is to know exactly what it meant for him. So through him, we are made to understand what it means to be modern in that sense. So let's take a closer look at the book in which Viollet-le-Duc's mechanicized limb is illustrated, The History of the Draftsman, L'Histoire d'un dessinateur. It's a didactic tale, as I said, and written, as I said again, just a few weeks before he died. It offered a summary and a final testament of Viollet-le-Duc's educational ideas. So it was embodying his ideas about pedagogy. It is one, and this is very important to understand this context, it's one of 5 didactic novels that Viollet-le-Duc wrote after the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. So he started after the War of 1870, which, of course, as you I imagine know, that France was defeated in the most dramatic way. And Viollet-le-Duc, by the way, himself went to war. He had his own battalion of workers. He actually brought the workers on his construction sites to fight and actually do, engineering works at the front. So he was himself implicated in the war itself, and the French lost, and for him this completely demoralized him. And these novels were, by the way, were published in the same collection as Jules Verne, so they were edited by Hetzel, who published Jules Verne, and Viollet-le-Duc himself, he says, these books are my, I'm doing some architectural Jules Verne, he would say. So he was completely devastated by France's military failure and convinced that there was nothing to be gained by addressing an older generation. So the Patriot in Viollet-le-Duc decided to reach out directly to the children, as he says, of all classes, and to teach the young people of France how to think and muster the energy to get up in the morning and set to work. These are extracts from letters with Hetzel. And in this sense, these set of 5 didactic novellas aimed at a teenage audience, so they're aimed at about an age of between, say, 14 to 17 years old, often fraught with tensions and playing up the devastation of the war, form an early example of what's called in France a revanchiste literature. In other words, aim at galvanizing the younger French generation and preparing them to exact revenge from the Germans. So Viollet-le-Duc was very much into that kind of writing. He wrote essentially these novels to regenerate his country, and that so we can take revenge on the Germans. And L'Histoire d'un dessinateur is the last and ultimate product of this series, aimed at such regeneration. So already at this broad level, the idea of playing with one's inheritance is present, in the sense that the idea of regeneration is always dependent upon the rejection of one's immediate past or natural parents to find new ones, as we will see. The book, in terms of the storyline, it's a story of apprenticeship. So here, that's the only image in which we see the 2 main protagonists. So it relates the encounter between Petit Jean, as you see here, an 11-year-old country boy, son of Père Lupeault, with Monsieur Majorin, which we see here, who's an eccentric bachelor with an independent mind who owns a successful manufacturer located near Paris. So he's an industrialist. He doesn't look like an industrialist from our point of view, but that's the way he is in the novel. And the story opens when Majorin, visiting the Lupeault family, takes notice of an unusual drawing that Petit Jean made of his cat, the first figure of the illustrated novel. So you understand, this is a children's book. And detecting unusual powers of observation, he proposed a few days later to Père Lupeault to take Jean as his pupil, asking full custody of the boy as if he was his adopted son. At first glance, it's a totally innocuous story. So I'm sure if most of you read this book, you would just say, it's a typical didactic tale, old style, with a moral, with a good ending, and we must become rational beings and things like that. But a few aspects make it much more interesting and draws our attention further and encourages, at least encouraged me to deep probe further. First thing, the novella is clearly autobiographical, an aspect which has been noted by many historians before me. So the two protagonists of l'histoire d'un dessinateur, that was the master and the disciple in a story of apprenticeship, are but idealized projections of the sort of mentorship that Viollet-le-Duc himself had been subjected to as a child. And here is Viollet-le-Duc as a child. And his evil uncle, Etienne Delecluse. So Etienne Delecluse, who was his uncle, was a failed painter who was trained in the atelier of David, no less, became a very, very well-known art critic in the Parisian scene. And he said himself he has stolen his nephew from the crib to conduct a didactic experiment. That's what himself he has described, what he's done. Now, I don't want to go into much details. If you're interested in these details, you can read the first chapter of my book on Viollet-le-Duc, which goes at length in that relationship. But let's just say that mentorship had been extremely traumatic. And even from certain exchange of letters, though I can never prove this, I suspect a case of sexual molestation, but there's no way to prove this, of course. But whether it went through such extreme or not, it was an immensely distressing experience, as Viollet-le-Duc himself has acknowledged in several instances. He's written long, long letters describing how vicious the mentorship had been, and the whole family of Delecluse. I mean, there's really eloquent documents for that. It may not be so surprising that Viollet-le-Duc, a few weeks before his death, would want to revisit his traumatic childhood. I mean, we're supposed to do that before we die. Though he died very suddenly, but perhaps he sensed death coming, and to be retrospective about your own childhood seems like something not unusual. But what is surprising is that he would want to raise that painful experience into an ideal pedagogical model. That is surprising. You may want to be retrospective about your childhood, especially if that childhood was traumatic, but the idea that you would write a book and make that childhood a model for the entire country is a bit strange. So again, the issue of inheritance comes up. Rewriting his past, Viollet-le-Duc seeks to transform it into an ideal pedagogical model. It's an act of restoration, like he's done all his life. But instead of restoring the Middle Ages, Viollet-le-Duc is now investigating his own childhood, biography replacing history. And as in all of Viollet-le-Duc's dealing with the past, it is a healing relationship, his own sad experience being transformed into a happy one. So you would think that he would obliterate all the traumas and sort of make good, kind of idealized version of what his childhood should have been, perhaps. But his childhood traumas are not obliterated, and that's what makes the thing so fascinating. They are turned into a pedagogical method. The central operation of l'histoire d'un dessinateur is actually to turn the source of trauma into a protection shield against that very trauma. In psychoanalytical terms, you would say that this novel is a quest, the quest of a desiring self for fulfillment that will deliver it from the anxieties of reality, but will still contain that reality. So you want to have your cake and eat it. So it's which you can do in fictions. Now, I'm not sure if you're willing to follow me on this, but that's the path I'm going to take to analyze this novel. It's not so long, by the way. Don't get discouraged. It should be in less than half an hour about. Okay. L'histoire d'un dessinateur opens with two successive acts of defamiliarization, as it were, one being the consequence of the other. First, as I already said, Petit-Jean draws an odd sketch of a cat that breaks completely the expectations and leads to a little quarrel with his friend André. So there's a particular scene that opens the book where Petit-Jean draws this drawing, and he's completely mesmerized by his cat. And he draws it like this. It's a very kind of somber, dark view of his cat. And his friends and other people around him just come mock him. He says, "What is this? A cat with a tail sticking out of his head, and it has only two legs. This is not a cat." So, and then Majorin comes, you know, and says, and he's fascinated by it because he thinks that shows an incredible capacity to see. And this triggers the whole story. So in seeing the great originality of the drawing, Majorin proposed to tutor Petit-Jean, which means to remove him from his family. Now, the later element, in my view, is the most decisive. The pedagogical experiment assumes that Petit-Jean is torn from his natural family, and that's very emphatic in the novel. So, and you know, I have to emphasize the sudden and absolutely uncompromised way in which Majorin offers to take care of Petit-Jean. It's a generous offer, you know, because Petit-Jean is in a very poor family, he has no future, so here he comes and says, I'll make something of him. So when he makes his proposal to, you know, Père Lupeault, the father, Petit-Jean's father, Majorin's tone becomes absolutely terse, if not outright aggressive, in face of the father's first reluctance. So the father says, well, you know, it's my son. And then, you know, Majorin said, well, you know, no discussion. If you want it, you know, this is my offer, take it or leave it, etc. It goes on and on. And then Majorin even specifies that there's a 6-month period, trial period. If Petit-Jean does not measure up to his expectation, he will have to go back to his family. Of course, Petit-Jean successfully passed the 6-month trial period, at which point Majorin confronts him with an ultimatum. He says, either you decide to go back to your family, or you must solemnly pledge to work assiduously and always follow with deference my instructions. So it's pretty terse. You could say, well, that's sort of 19th century-ish. But there's something quite, you'll see. So, and if we add to this the fact that, you know, Majorin refuses that Petit-Jean go back to his family, he can go back to his family only in day outings. He cannot do a sleepover with his family. So it's all laid out, like there's a system of rule for the pedagogical experiment to work. And this is completely concords with Viollet-le-Duc's definition of what military life is about. And I quote one of the many essays that Viollet-le-Duc wrote on warfare. He was very interested in warfare, especially after the Franco-Prussian War. And he wrote the following. He says, the day a citizen is called to arms, he must cease contact with his home, his family, his environment. His family, his home, is the regiment to which he now belongs. End of quote. The same can be said of Petit-Jean, whose new home is the master-disciple relationship. Now, given Viollet-le-Duc's obsessive goal after 1870 to put back the nation on its feet, the parallel with military life is completely opposite, of course. Reforming education was the first and the most basic stage of his plan to create new hardened individuals able to thrive within the new military industrial era. By the way, I should say that Viollet-le-Duc was extremely aware. He wrote a very eloquent page about describing very lucidly the new nature of warfare. The Franco-Prussian War with the American Civil War are the first truly industrial warfare. And he absolutely analyzed that in great details. But now let's consider what Petit-Jean learned through this apprenticeship. Now, he learned how to draw. This is the title, right? He learns how to draw, which means for Viollet-le-Duc to learn how to see. So the severe discipline primarily hinge on that. Now, what does it mean? So it's interesting to go a bit deeper in what he actually was learning. So not only was Petit-Jean required to keep his own sketch and notebooks during the day, but he was forced to recopy everything from the start in the evening in case he should lose one of his sketchbooks. Drawing will soon grow compulsive, as it had become for Viollet-le-Duc in his childhood. Viollet-le-Duc was almost autistic. He was a compulsive draftsman, like he couldn't stop drawing. So I quote from the book here, from the novel, at lunch in his mind, Petit-Jean placed the plates and decanters in perspective. He looked out the window at the landscape and drew it with an imaginary pencil. With the aid of a match, he tried to draw on the tablecloth the contour of the cat purring on the cushion. So it grows to be compulsive to draw. So the compulsion to draw in his mind everything around him was not merely a side effect of Petit-Jean's apprenticeship, it was the deliberate aim of Majorin's pedagogy. So the latter explains in the book, he says, and I quote from Majorin's mouth, he says, one who has acquired the habit of drawing without fatigue, without being obliged to make an effort, draws all that he looks at attentively. In other words, he performs while looking what he would do if he wished to reproduce the object on paper. So when you learn how to draw, you always draw the world, even if you're not drawing. So learning how to see meant to always duplicate the world around us, constantly rebuilding mentally one's surrounding, as the following recommendation given by Majorin to Petit-Jean makes clear, and that's a very important quote. So he says, when you see anything, a piece of furniture, a tool, or house, you must ask how it is made, with what, and why, and try to guess it yourself. When you see an animal, big or little, a horse or a sheep, or an insect or a bird, you must ask what it does in order to walk, to defend itself, to get sustenance, and to fly. When you see a plant, you must ask how it comes up from the earth, how it pushes forth shoots, and watch closely and see how the leaves, flowers, and fruits are attached. In other words, the act of seeing becomes a relentless activity of restoration, as if the world no longer appeared to the beholder on its own accord, but needed to be summoned, as if on the brink of breaking apart. Again, Viollet-le-Duc's goal was to make the French youth alert, always ready to act within their surroundings. So it reflected his opinion that France was a devastated site, needing to be rebuilt from the ground up. But at the more intimate level, his conception takes on the character of mourning, predicated on loss and trauma, or a dose of trauma, a slight dose of trauma, as I will try to explain to you. That aspect is particularly well emphasized in the crucial chapter titled Petit Jean begins to see, ou Petit Jean commence à voir. It takes place in an early day of spring, and it describes the boy's first true awakening. And it's described in the book, one of those psychological moments when revelation comes and sudden progress is made. It was of such importance that when Jean grew older, he admitted that this day, and I quote again, this day was never effaced from my memory. So I'm sure you've all experienced that kind of threshold moment. And the first spur to this watershed moment was Petit Jean's attraction towards young spring plants, burst, and I quote again, bursting from their glutinous envelope and flowers peeping through the carpet of dead leaves. So it's a spring event. And from the suggestive form of the plants illustrated, we gather that Jean's awakening may have carried a sexual dimension. But his fascination towards spring bloom was only the first stage of Jean's so-called awakening. The most decisive step was triggered by this sense of guilt from turning down a visit to see his family. And it is this evil mentor, Majorin, who deliberately engineers that trauma. So I quote from the book. Noticing what Jean was absorbed in doing, so Majorin was actually watching Jean while he was fascinated with these spring blooms, and wishing to test him, Majorin said, "Tell me, little one, is it not more than a fortnight since you went to see your mother and the rest of your family? Would you like to go with me to your father's?" But Petit Jean is so absorbed in his drawing of plants that he shows very little enthusiasm. He doesn't pay attention because he's so absorbed in what he's doing. So Majorin can then easily manipulate him to admit that he prefers drawing than going to see his family. Once left alone, however, Jean immediately comes to his senses and realizes that he has sacrificed the pleasure of a visit to see his family to his desire to draw. He is about to change his mind, but then he recalls Majorin's advice to remain steadfast when following one's duty. Here's a very important quote again. So Petit Jean, therefore, absorbed his grief, took his album, and went straight to the end of the garden without turning his head. Involuntarily, 2 or 3 big tears fell on this paper when he seated himself before some of the plants he wished to draw. As Petit Jean progressed in his work of copying plants, he felt a contentment he had never before known. These models seemed to him the more precious because he had sacrificed a great pleasure to them. See the notion of sacrifice embedded in the act of seeing. Little plants, he said to himself, I love you very much because I'm going to remain with you rather than to see my father and mother. Little plants, you must let copy you and help me make pretty drawings so to please my friend, his mentor. And when sudden opening of spring blooms made the tiny stalk nod and quiver, it seemed to Jean as if the plants were answering him. Now, in these few sentences are reunited key psychological ingredients that have shaped Viollet-le-Duc's own childhood. First, the necessity to draw to please his mentor, which was the case with Etienne Delecluze, where he was like in a really harsh discipline of drawing every day. And with the attendant separation from his family, because his uncle took the kid away from his family. Second, the secret contentment of drawing, which becomes a portal into an imaginary world. And then the silent conversation that Jean carries with the miniature world of spring plants as a sort of compensatory fantasy to calm his anxieties. So Viollet-le-Duc does hint at the dialectic of loss and recovery as essential for learning how to see. Ultimately, what Petit-Jean's been able to contemplate in that chapter, in which he begins to see, is the immense and infinite vitality of the world. He perceives nature. It's very linked to for me, all this is very linked to Louis Sullivan's early writings. So it is the sense of loss which imparts the strength of sensation in seeing. In other words, the sense of loss ties perception to a mythic first time of naive experience. You see the real, whereby the viewer kept touch with the world's unsettling power. And there's many evidence of that. I don't want to go into too much detail. So the concept of the innocent eye that's so embedded in the idea of modern art is in fact, judging from that book, is in fact predicated upon loss and trauma. In other words, we can only perceive the world's life force, its primitive formative energies, when that world is on the brink of destruction, when everything is falling into pieces, and as it only then that the will to rebuild is awakened. That is what the capacity to draw means. So the sense of loss that Majorin is rather cruelly cultivating in his young pupil can be easily transposed to Viollet-le-Duc's entire teenage audience, whom reading L'Histoire d'un dessinateur in 1879, in other words, they're 12, 13, 14 years old, reading in 1879 that novel, would well remember, of course, the Franco-Prussian conflict of 1870, when they were about 5 to 6 years old. So it's a kind of maintaining this traumatic event, the memory in some subliminal way, as the principle at the base of a national regeneration. So their capacity to see, according to Viollet-le-Duc, will thus depend upon the incorporation of such a traumatic memory, because only it provides the most powerful source of a compulsion to rebuild. The return of primitive force within the modern world, in this case the emergence of a total industrial warfare, was to become the founding image for the reconstruction of a new French collective ego. The chapter on Petit-Jean's comparative anatomy lesson, which ends on the mechanized limbs that I showed earlier, comes immediately after Petit-Jean begins to see. So the anatomy lessons come immediately after the chapter that I've just described. So once the young apprentice reaches a first degree of awareness of the vitality that runs throughout nature, only then can the anatomy lessons begin. Now, the meaning of anatomy for Viollet-le-Duc is a very vast one. For him, it's a kind of world secret. They start by looking at rather two terrifying creatures, a bat and a dinosaur of some form, thus setting the theme of nature's great variety with an undertow of monstrosity before moving to human anatomy. So they actually move to human anatomy. And it is, of course, once the secret of anatomy is disclosed that Petit-Jean gains a more conscious understanding of the productive forces at work in nature, and he is thus capable to understand industrialization's goal of creating a second nature. The organs of man's machine, declares Majorin, must now be made in conformity to the principles of his own body. That idea and the accompanying image summarize the principle guiding the entire didactic novel. L'Histoire d'un dessinateur is not really about the education of Petit-Jean, but about his remaking. Petit-Jean is a prosthetic being. At the end of the story, Majorin indeed claims Petit-Jean as being his work, rightfully considering him as his child. And these are quotes. With the Histoire des Dessinateurs, the aging Viollet-le-Duc reimagines his own conception through a family romance in which he becomes his own progenitor. This autogenic fantasy of self-creation is the condition to produce the new subject liberated from traumatic anxieties, or more accurately, trauma, embodied in military discipline of learning how to see and the experience of warfare, becomes the basis of the construction of a new self. Collectively, war is indeed the vital regenerator. And I quote Viollet-le-Duc, he says, "War is the sole agent capable of conserving the moral energy which gives nation its power and cohesion." Warfare has the same role as trauma and loss at the level of the individual. It forces the nation into a state of self-recreation, an autogenesis. A few years before writing the Histoire d'un dessinateur, Viollet-le-Duc described the modern soldier. He describes it as follows. He writes, "The soldier has become nothing but a force transmitted to a weapon. The more that weapon will be perfected, the more men will be reduced to the state of a trigger mechanism." Quite perceptive when we think of today's war. An absolute mechanized conception of warfare, however, was despicable to Viollet-le-Duc, which is actually interesting. something ignoble which he associates with the German army. A superior French military training, he says, assumes that soldiers have personalized their weapon, bringing their own intelligent provision knowledge into play. Only then can it be ensured the superiority, and I quote again, of that horrifying mechanism which we call a weapon. The mechanism, in other words, must always find its place back into living, adaptable, organic life. And of course, the family romance extends to a national romance. Viollet-le-Duc will want to create ancestors for this new hardened, mechanized, prosthetic soldier. The Robocop of the 19th century may have killed his father and mother, but he has grandparents. This comes through in the 5th and 6th volume of Viollet-le-Duc's remarkable Dictionnaire raisonné du mobilier de la période carolingienne jusqu'à la Renaissance, a study of medieval weaponry published just a few years before Histoire d'un dessinateur. The intimate and vital relationship between soldier and weapon is the subject of these volumes. In the preface, Viollet-le-Duc describes his goal, which is the same as the Histoire d'un dessinateur. He describes it as a goal of national regeneration, and I quote, this is a preface to this work on medieval armament. He says, if this last part of our work can contribute to impress upon the mind the love of the craft of war, if it can demonstrate how, after so many unprecedented disasters, France has been able to recover, we think we will have fulfilled a small part of the task that each Frenchman must carry today. So these medieval knights, these men covered in iron, as he calls them, were models for the hardened soldiers of the future. Viollet-le-Duc transposed the entire modern militarized state into the Middle Ages. Feudal society, thanks to its perpetual state of warfare, had given birth to new iron creatures, just as 19th century industrial Europe was in the process of entering a new type of mechanized warfare with soldier weapons, as he calls them. Much of Viollet-le-Duc's wonderful, they're truly wonderful, and manically detailed history of medieval armament centers on the adaptation of body to weapon and weapon to body. Many hundreds of fascinating illustrations depict medieval warriors as organisms that evolve, that's his word, evolve into a protective shield, speculating that medieval armorers modeled their work on the shells of animals or insects. His essential point is that armor was forged through a very delicate observation of the dispositions of the play of muscles and physical movement. And he has even comparative illustrations how they were adapted to human anatomy to produce responsive metallic military clothing, as he calls them. And Viollet-le-Duc adds that these medieval war garments are the more astonishing, and I quote, given that medieval industrialists didn't possess the anatomical knowledge so familiar to us today, which dovetails perfectly, of course, to the mechanized limb that concluded Petit-Jean's anatomy class. So he pays attention to the ingenuity and dexterity that allowed the relationship between weapon and organic activity to develop, how Gothic soldiers had become living machines. What this last quote shows again is that, according to Viollet-le-Duc, the construction of armament, or any technical invention for that matter, is not so much an application of knowledge, as if we have the science first and then we apply it, but is a product of a living process. With his study of medieval weaponry, Viollet-le-Duc established affiliation for French military power in the quasi-biological sense of the term, showing how the true soldier were born out of the behavior of living Frenchmen, that's to say, of actions of organisms at work. That organic behavior, kindled by a state of warfare, must return into the modern world. Thank you very much.